Good evening and welcome to the 2026 Aquinas Lecture. The Aquinas Lecture is an annual event celebrating the theological legacy of St. Thomas Aquinas, jointly organized by the Faculty of Theology and the Theology Students Society. Since its inception in 2010, these lectures have welcomed several distinguished speakers. This year, we welcome Professor John Milbank. Professor John Milbank is a prominent contemporary theologian and a leading founder of the radical orthodoxy movement. He served as Professor of Religion, Politics and Ethics at the University of Nottingham, also directing the Centre of Theology and Philosophy at the same university. Earlier in his career, he held the Francis Myers Ball Chair of Philosophical Theology at the University of Virginia and was a reader in theology and fellow of Peterhouse at the University of Cambridge. In recognition of his work, the University of Cambridge awarded him the Doctor of Divinity, one of its highest academic degrees. I would like now to invite Wayne Gaia, the President of the Theology Students Society, to say a few words of welcome to you all.
Reverend Dean Professor Stefano Attard, distinguished guests, members of the Faculty of Theology and the Theology Students Association, fellow students and guests, I would like to welcome you all to this year's Aquinas Lecture. It is our honor to welcome you all to such a special event, since this year is the 80th anniversary of the Theology Students Association. Throughout his illustrious career, Professor John Milbank, whom we graciously thank for accepting our invitation, has redefined how we perceive the modern world. Through his 1990 masterpiece entitled Theology and Social Theory Beyond Secular Reason, Professor Milbank argues that once there was no secular. It is important to note that he defines the secular as the idea of a neutral, non-religious space, which is not a natural element, but theology in disguise. This idea is extremely important, especially today, where human rights and human dignity are the pinnacle of both secular and theological conversation. It is important to remember that though Thomas Aquinas lived over 800 years ago, his insights on theology are still very valid to this day, and therefore we mustn't look at this event as a history lesson on someone who gave important contributions to his time, but instead we ought to see today's event as a way to reclaim a way of seeing the world that isn't fragmented by modern secularism. And we may give a helping hand in bettering through the wisdom given to us by Thomas Aquinas and scholars who continue to study and adapt his teaching to contemporary times. This year's title, Did Aquinas Have a Trinitarian Metaphysics?, has the key term of Trinitarian. This is the highlight of the entire statement and the highlight of what we study today. If God is Trinity, meaning a community of persons, then reality itself is relational and gift-based rather than individualistic. This means that all of humanity is called to serve each other, as Christ said at the washing of the feet, that no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. With this framework in mind, a Trinitarian metaphysics brings forth a society that holds to heart the value of being at service, especially through sharing and participation. Unfortunately, modernity does not view society in this way, but rather that those of ownership and power are the pinnacle and movers of society. Through his work, Professor Milbank has often emphasized that theology is a social science, or rather the only true social science. Therefore, if we lose the Trinitarian understanding of being at service to a community, we reduce the value of a human being to solely their social status and market. Unfortunately, this false and mistaken sense of value that has penetrated society brings forth great harm, corruption, and war, to name a few. While many still use the immeasurable power of religion to falsely justify wrong actions, no one must mistake what is truly happening. As Professor Milbank discusses in Theology and Social Theory, when speaking of corruption, which unfortunately has been a prominent theme in Malta these past few years, These bad actions are not just about bad people doing bad actions. It is good people, no matter what they have done, who are doing the bad actions. These bad actions are what we see as evil rather than the people being themselves evil. If a system assumes that human beings are naturally competitive individuals seeking the completion of their own individual agendas, society spirals into an abyss, as Scripture shows us through the narrative of the Tower of Babel. As a continuation of what Professor Milbank argues in Theology and Social Theory about corruption, he states that it is the privatization of the common good. When humanity erases the true value of a human person, everyone and everything becomes a commodity to be bought or sold. As I already mentioned, war is also a main theme in Professor Milbank's work, especially when it comes to peace. He critiques the modern view that peace is solely the absence of war, and the ontology of violence, meaning the belief that conflict is the natural state of the world, as presented by Hobbes and Machiavelli, to name a few. He instead offers the Christian view of an ontology of peace, with peace being the original state and the purpose of creation. If one were to look at the wars today in Ukraine, Gaza, and Iran, to name a few, they are not solely political failures, but metaphysical failures. They are the result of a world that sees market value over intrinsic value. They see the world as lost of hope and only full of the despair that conflict brings forth. As believers in Christ, we must never encourage this feeling. We must always believe in the hope of a better world and peace. As Professor Milbank states, true peace is only possible if we believe that the world is created in love, not in conflict. Therefore, I encourage everyone to take 2 seconds out of their day to hope for a better world. That is all it takes. First, we must believe, and we must truly hope, so that then we may act on that same hope. It is hope that drives peace and bridges theology and secular thought. In an age where being normal seems to be, as St. Carlo Aquinas says, photocopies of one another, leading us to fall into the dark abyss of despair, perhaps being radically hopeful is the only solution to truly embrace the teachings of Christ and to be movers of society, driving it to be one of peace and service to others.
Thank you, Wayne, for the introduction, and once again, thank you to the Students' Association for their contribution in the organizing of tonight's event. Now we will have our first musical interlude for the evening, where flautist Clara Mouliet will perform the Adagio from Flute Sonata in A minor by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, son of the renowned J.S. Bach. Thank you, Clara, for that beautiful performance. I would like to invite now the Dean of our faculty, Reverend Professor Stefan Aktad, to say a few words for this occasion.
Professor John Milbank, Professor Claude Manjon, Head of the Department of Philosophy, colleagues and distinguished guests. I am honored and pleased to be addressing you this evening as we celebrate the patron of the Faculty of Theology, namely Thomas Aquinas. This annual lecture has become the most important event in our annual calendar, such that we have now become bearers of an old tradition that has been alive for decades. The Faculty of Theology is dedicated to the study and advancement of knowledge in areas such as sacred scripture, philosophy, church history and doctrine, patrology, liturgy, moral theology and ethics, spiritual theology and other related fields. Its mission is to cultivate a rigorous academic environment that promotes theological research of the highest standard, research that deepens our understanding of human dignity in light of divine revelation. This academic pursuit is inherently interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, as theology both shapes and is shaped by developments in the arts, the human and the empirical sciences. Allow me to take you back to last year's lecture delivered by the Polish scholar Reverend Professor Waldemar Chrostowski, who chose to speak about the meaning of the Jubilee in the Bible. Professor Chrostowski provided a comprehensive examination of the biblical origins and evolution of the Jubilee, beginning with the foundational concept of the Sabbath as a method of sanctifying time. He illustrated how the rhythm of the seventh day expanded into the sabbatical year, which mandated agricultural rest, debt remission, and the release of slaves to ensure social justice. This cycle culminated every 50 years in the Jubilee year, a period of universal liberation intended to restore ancestral property and reconcile the community with God. Chrostowski argued that while these ordinances functioned as a moral ideal or prophecy for the future, they found ultimate spiritual fulfillment in the messianic mission of Jesus Christ. Finally, his speech traced the transition of these ancient traditions into the Catholic Church's practice of holy years, concluding with the significance of the Jubilee of 2025. I was particularly struck by the idea that time that is not divided into periods can instill a sense of fear and insecurity, and that we therefore tame time, as he said, by establishing weeks, months, seasons, feasts, and celebrations of various kinds. Interestingly, Professor Milbank himself is presently writing a book that will be published later this year and that will be titled, did I remember correctly, Ontology, Time and Motion, or Trinity, Time and Motion. Trinity, Time and Motion. There you are, time again. So yet today we will touch upon a subject that is not subject to time. The question of whether Aquinas' understanding of being was Trinitarian takes us to another dimension. The Trinity and metaphysics are, in fact, two subjects that are not easy to comprehend. Yet, as far as the Trinity is concerned, it is intriguing that we can speak about it at all because of the taming brought about by the revelation of God. Unless God revealed himself, though even this is to a certain degree, we would never have been remotely able to even broach the subject of the Godhead. To put it crudely, revelation brought about the taming of God. Religions of the ancient Near East were partly characterized by fear because the worshippers did not truly know their non-existent gods. God's revelation has dispelled fear and brought peace. As the Anglican theologian Bernard Dozier rightly put it, doubt is not the opposite of faith. Fear is. In this respect, it is noteworthy that last year our faculty organized a conference titled Nicaea and Beyond, Implications for Contemporary Christianity. That conference gave us the opportunity to delve more deeply into the mystery of the second person of the Trinity, Jesus. It is evident that the mystery of Christ could only be penetrated in stages. Along the same lines, last Sunday's Gospel, the beautiful account in John 9 of the healing of the man born blind, points to a gradual deepening of the understanding of who Jesus truly is. At our faculty, we are primarily interested in helping our students embark on this journey of discovery. Only a few days ago, I was speaking about the historicity of the book of Jonah to one of my classes, and I mentioned the curious account of how a whale swallowed up the prophet. A student wittingly remarked, "I cannot quite digest it." Okay. I trust that irrespective of one's take on the historicity of Jonah's account, tonight's audience will be able to digest and be more amenable to the discourse we will shortly hear about the Trinity and metaphysics. It is indeed necessary to have a faculty that draws direct inspiration from heavenly realities, asks questions of ultimate meaning, and also seeks to understand how this influences our lives here and beyond. We dare to speak even about the Trinity and all the realities created by the Godhead, because God Himself spoke. The introduction in Exodus 20 to what we usually call the Ten Commandments is actually the following: Vayedaber Elohim et kol hadevarim ha'eleh lemor. And God spoke all these words, saying. The sacred author could simply have stated, and God said. Rather, he uses several related terms that point to this divine speech: spoke, words, saying. Our God is one who enters into a relationship with us and communicates his thoughts. This evening, we cannot miss the international flavor of our event. A British man will address a predominantly Maltese audience, speaking about an Italian man. What is the connection between the three? It is not the fact that the academic career of Aquinas was itself international, centered in the major intellectual institutions of medieval Europe. Rather, it is an interest in our Trinitarian God, who is deeply intertwined with our human condition. For this reason, it is this interest that ultimately animates all the teaching and research endeavors of our faculty. In the last years, we have been working on a proposal to obtain a research cluster that will focus, among other things, on mystagogy. This research analysis will integrate philosophy, performance, and visual art framed through gendered and theological lenses. It will investigate how mystical experience is mediated through the body, desire, and the sacred, with a focus on the erotic dimensions of mysticism in both female and male traditions. Central to this analysis is the mystagogical method, which serves as an interpretative framework for understanding mystical embodiment. Thematic emphasis is on the mystical flesh, exploring how mystical experiences are lived, expressed, and interpreted through gendered and corporeal perspectives in both historical and contemporary contexts. Hence, how does one enter and dwell within mystery through the body and the senses? In mystagogy, contemplation is not mere introspection, but participation in divine life. It is where the mystical meets the embodied, becoming a lived theology. Professor Milbank, thank you for flying to Malta to share your deep insights with us. Yesterday, Professor Milbank told me that he had visited Malta only once before and that he landed on the island the same day that the Azure window in Dweira Gozo came tumbling down. That is on 8 March 2017. I couldn't remember the date yesterday, but there you go, 9 years ago. Today, he is here to open for us another window, a window of rich insights, thank you, and knowledge that looks onto Aquinas, his metaphysics, and the mystery of the Trinity. As many people, not only locally but across the world, sadly celebrate the feast of St. Patrick today by getting inebriated with alcohol, something Aquinas warned against, we are fortunate to be sitting here opting for temperance, a virtue which the medieval scholar encouraged, ready to have our fill of knowledge whose satisfaction endures. So thank you once again for being with us.
Thank you, Reverend Professor Attad, for your holistic and well-researched introduction. Now I would like to invite once again Clara for our second musical performance tonight, this time Jade, from 3 pieces by Pierre-Octave Ferraud. Thank you once again, Clara, for that beautiful performance. We arrive now to the highlight of today's event, the Aquinas lecture by Professor Milbank. Did Aquinas have a Trinitarian metaphysics?
Well, one thing I'm absolutely sure of, that this is not going to be the highlight after those superb flute pieces, very, very inspiring talks by both faculty and students. And thank you also for all the kind words. It's an enormous privilege to be back in Malta, and I'm going to try to atone for the feeling of guilt I still have about the window. You know, I arrived, the next town goes out, and it was gone. You know, you know, the British have brought this side on many things for. Probably go both good and evil, but perhaps not often have they brought, particularly if they're Anglicans like myself, have they arrived bearing a lecture about Thomas Aquinas. That's probably a relatively unusual event, but if that seems a bit strange, then I think there's nothing strange at all about giving a talk on Aquinas in Malta for some of the reasons that have already been said. Obviously, there's the powerful Italian connection, but also Malta is in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's between European and North African civilizations, and everything about the world of theology and philosophy in which Aquinas was operating was a world deeply impacted by the reading of Jewish and Arabic thought, as well as by the rereading of the Church Fathers. So it was an international Mediterranean context, and it seems to me that Malta is an incredibly appropriate place, therefore, to be trying to give a lecture about Aquinas. My lecture is going to sort of focus on really three things very simply. The question of the way in which God is one and God is three are connected to each other in Aquinas. And secondly, the question of whether we only know the Trinity by revelation, or can we also, at least to some extent, get to the Trinity by the operation of our reason. And the question is whether our understanding of the Trinity, whether in the case of Aquinas, his understanding of the Trinity affects his fundamental metaphysics. In other words, his account of the structure, not just of infinite, but of finite reality. So there exists today a certain account of the doctrine of the Trinity and of its emergence within the school of so-called Thomistic ressourcement. Thomistic ressourcement is a theological tendency which is basically an attempt to resist, through supposed integration and surpassing, the original ressourcement enterprise of the French Nouvelle Théologie that was concerned to retrieve for today the full insights of the Church Fathers. But at the core of the current movement of Thomistic ressourcement lies a basic defense of the notion of pure nature, of a pure natural end of man independent of grace, even though this position is surely not found in Aquinas himself and was rejected on the basis, I think, of sound scholarship by the Nouvelle Théologie as a Baroque aberration. In reality, then, in the case of Thomistic ressourcement, we are faced, I think, with an attempted revival of neo-Thomism, and it's significant that so much of this revival is going on in the currently deeply disturbed United States of America. Now, in the case of the articulation of Trinitarian doctrine, most notably by Gilles Emery and by Thomas Joseph White, a duality of nature and grace involves also a duality of the one God known to reason and the triune God known only by revelation. A metaphysics of being is demanded by the demonstration of the one God, but not by faith in the triune God. Belief in the latter is rather a matter of specifically human salvation, located within a metaphysical context that it by no means seems to transfigure. Thus, we are assured by Gilles Emery that the Trinity has nothing to do with the relationship of the one to the many, or with the triadic structure of reality. Yet, clearly, religious monotheism has something to do with metaphysical monism, or the insistence specifically on one God from whom everything proceeds out of nothing, would be meaningless. If the assertion that God is not only one but also three has nothing to do with ontological plurality, it might appear that what is revealed to us about God can scarcely be connected with what we know according to reason, leaving the doctrine of the Trinity in a sort of propositional limbo. If God is God, then in some way the subordinate rest of reality must reflect his deity. Its ultimate order and unity, for example, must echo his nature, or at least his unified will. But is not this then true also of God's threefold character, even were we to allow that there is no sheerly rational intimation of that character? Otherwise, is grace just irrelevant to our understanding of the way things are? And does our salvation offer us no insight into the divine nature, even though into the divine interior, even so, though such theosophy, as Antonio Rosmini dared to call it in the 19th century, would appear to be at the heart of the Trinitarian claim? The risk seems to be that we'll be left with something little better than the desperate sterility of the Protestant Yale School assertion that the Trinity tells us nothing about how God is in himself, but somehow and for some reason regulates the grammar of Christian worship and proclamation, as if otherwise it might get out of hand, perhaps. It can seem more than curious to declare that the Trinity has no metaphysical implication, and yet also correctly to insist with Thomas Joseph White that only the immanent Trinity within God himself, rather than the supposed economic Trinity, which I agree with him is a 19th century invention, to insist that the immanent Trinity is the real Trinity and therefore is the very foundation of reality. Is this doctrine then just a secret fact about the absolute, an intuitive belief in which confers membership of a secret club? A kind of Gnosticism without mystical insight that characterizes Sunni Islam at its worst, as Remy Brague suggests. For his part, as a scholar of Aquinas, Emery has very well argued for the intimate linkage in Thomas of the outgoing of the Logos from the Father and the outgoing of creation from God. Ironically, he's done almost more than anybody else to demonstrate that. And yet in Emery's hierarchy of doctrine, not only is the one God placed above the three in one, the doctrines of the Trinity, incarnation and passion of Christ, are then placed above the short remainder of the creed. With what warrant can one say, as Emery does, that while we truly believe in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit and the Incarnation, we should only believe that the Church has been established by God? The Creed would seem to say otherwise, and to imply some sort of continuity, not only between Trinity and creation, but also between Trinity, creation, and Church, both as an eternal reality and as the outcome of the most ultimately revelatory disclosures of a series of bizarre historical events. Is not somehow the whole point of Christianity that the absolute is ontologically leveled with the name of an obscure Roman procurator of Judea, Pontius Pilate? It is true that Emery and White sustain, in line with Aquinas, much of the core of patristic doctrine concerning the Trinity, together with its plausibility as a reading of the New Testament witness. They recognize that only with the Cappadocians was the combination of a single divine ousia in three hypostases clearly established. they realized that this became possible because the eternal generation of the Son had been both affirmed by Origen and envisaged by him in terms of the intellectual utterance of the Logos rather than of simple biology, in scare quotes. In this way, as White insists at length, the so-called psychological analogy to the Trinity is doctrinally fundamental and not merely illustrative. I think he's entirely right about that. He and Emery also see how the Cappadocian breakthrough already, in effect, understood the persons in substantively relational terms, although this consideration was later perfected by Augustine and Aquinas. Additionally, White clearly explains just how the medieval Franciscan path tended to deviate from this patristic orthodoxy. Given the univocity of being and the formal distinction, the Trinitarian persons became defined in terms of a projection of finite distinctions between nature and will, and between reason, substance, and volition that were too simplistic and atomizing, even in the case of finite ontology. Then, given later nominalism with William of Ockham and other people, it became impossible coherently to conceive either of a single divine essence or of real and irreducible divine relations. Finally, given much later Kantianism, it became impossible to reach God through the eminent path of the analogy of being, and this tended, as White says, to render the psychological analogy unusable. As he indicates, all this is compatible with the typical radical orthodoxy genealogy, which argues that the road to Kant is not one of objective critical progress in philosophy, but rather the unintended secularizing triumph of the idioms of often Franciscan rather than often Dominican theology, which includes a marginalizing through misunderstanding of the logic of patristic orthodoxy regarding the Trinity. According to this genealogy, which is primarily engendered by scholars outside RO, but RO has sort of taken it over and synthesized it. So according to this genealogy, the espousal of the univocity of being led to a consequent drift towards the metaphysical priority of transparently graspable distinctions that in turn engendered the gradual collapse of a metaphysics that had been, after Aristotle, poised aporetically between God and being into a new primacy of ontology, a word that only really came into existence in the early 17th century. This was then a pure doctrine of being with initial indifference to the division of uncreated from created, within which the account of God was now a natural theological subsection belonging to so-called special metaphysics. It's completely wrong, once you've understood this genealogy, to find any natural theology in Aquinas. There simply isn't, if you're being historically rigorous. That's a post-late scholastic development. The evolution of ontology itself led naturally and eventually to the so-called critical turn in philosophy, which was more of an evolution than an absolute break, as the usual accounts of Kant assume, because this turn eventually substituted skeptical epistemology for an already epistemologized ontology in terms of its reduction of being already to the clearly representable and objective because of the assumption that being is univocal and therefore always clear and distinct and therefore sort of convertible with what we can think rather than always presenting itself to us as a mystery of depth such that the church fathers like Gregory of Nyssa talk about an apophatic mystery of every creature, and not only of God. That's kind of lost long before we get to Kant, and then enables this kind of turn towards a kind of philosophical narcissism, where all we see of being is what we project onto being, and then we're trapped into that narcissistic space, as the great modern French philosopher Louis Lavelle talks about this in his wonderful book about Narcissus. So the Kantian epistemological reduction of theoretical philosophy entailed a banning of the projection of such clearly circumscribed finite terms upon the infinite as an illicit mode of speculation and transgression of the supposed limits of pure reason. We can't really read Kant as overturning Aquinas, because he doesn't really consider the kind of analogical vision that somebody like Aquinas actually had. So the argument would be that all this follows from the outworking of a university of being that largely came about within a Franciscan intellectual context, but leaves unexamined and so uncriticized the alternative possibilities opened by the Dominican tradition. Not just Aquinas, but also Albert the Great and all his German successors, including Dietrich of Freiberg, Meister Eckhart, and finally Nicholas Cusa, who really kind of stands in their wake. So with that fundamental genealogical story, Thomas Joseph White, who's professor in Rome, would seem to concur. So it's important to say that there are large areas of agreements here, although I'm going to go on to disagree. Franciscan theology is also condemned by White for arguing for intimations of the Trinity according to natural reason, as if, after all, this were perhaps the more ultimate root of the long-term rationalizing trouble in modernity, rather than the substitution of university for analogy. But I would venture instead that prior to Aquinas, in the predominantly Boethian tradition in the 12th century, as in the traditions also of the Christian East, there wasn't any real stark division between rational and revealed approaches to the Trinity, just as there was really very little distinction between rational and revealed theology. Something surely consequent upon the encounter with Arab culture that found it inherently hard to relate the rationalism of Greek philosophy to its very voluntaristic theological tradition of Kalam. Even in the case of Aquinas, who was still in several respects unusually Boethian for his period, he learns a lot from Boethius. Even in the case of Aquinas, I would argue that he doesn't really adhere to his own protocols with regard to the Trinity. He says, look, we only know about the Trinity at all through revelation. But then when you start to read the small print, it's not completely convincing that he's actually abiding by his own rules. That's part of my case. So in Aquinas, the analogical reading that takes us up to the one God, also in some places, particularly in the Summa Contra Gentiles, takes us up to the triune God in terms of ascending degrees of immanent emanation in the ontological hierarchy. So Aquinas says that sort of plants reproduce outside themselves, animals can kind of sense within themselves, and then finally human beings think within themselves, generating thoughts as intellectual words. And so he's saying all these things within the natural world in rising degrees point us ultimately towards a completely inner emanation that takes place in God. And although this is only mentioned briefly in the Summa Contra Gentiles, it's interestingly foregrounded in the Compendium Theologiae, where Aquinas is telling us what really matters for him in his overall thought. And I think that that is significant. It also concurs with Aquinas' increasing stress in the course of his writing upon the Son Logos as the inner divine ars, the inner divine art, which anticipates the external creation, and the fact that including within the divine generation, the paternal generation of the Son, is the decision to create and the eminent reality of the creation. Indeed, Gilles Emery himself insists upon this point. The decision to create for Aquinas is not actually later than the generation of the Son from the Father. Thus, the very name word implies a relation to creatures. Aquinas says at one point in De Veritate. And for this thematic, Aquinas was actually much indebted to his Parisian colleague, St. Bonaventure. But he also went beyond Bonaventure by insisting that the paternal intelligence does not exist at all without the expressive and relational uttering of the Logos, as Thomas Joseph White indeed correctly notes. Aquinas also radicalizes Bonaventure by invoking the Dionysian and ultimately Neoplatonic triad of essence, power, and operation, ousia, dunamis, and energeia. He takes this as imaging the divine Trinity. So under this scheme, Aquinas is able specifically to say that the creative onlook of the Son is not just a semantic appropriation to him of formal and intellectual free persons, but belongs to him properly, insofar as every essence acts only through a power, and in this case, the power, as it were, retro-constitutes the essence, and so is doubly necessary to its completed operation. Moreover, Aquinas says that this properly distinct creative role of the Son is true from the point of view of the thing produced, which is the creation, implying that it holds and is recognized from within the structure of creation itself as the constant emergence of form from matter, rather than in some inadmissible economic realm hovering between God and this world. That's the danger of any talk about an economic trinity. In other words, a Trinitarian ontology would appear to ensue in Aquinas at this point. Hence, Aquinas ultimately insists upon the inherent link between the Trinity and the creation still more than does the Franciscan master. While Aquinas nonetheless abandons a Trinitarian starting point for his theology in the Summa Theologiae, which he previously sustained in his sentence commentary following Peter Lombard's own order of treatment, Aquinas again introduces the Trinity within his initial discussion of God in his second Roman sentence commentary that was discovered only very recently in Merton College, Oxford. It was always known to be there, but we now actually have the text. And this text is roughly contemporary with the Summa, suggesting that you shouldn't read too much into the fact that in the Summa, Aquinas starts with the one God rather than the threefold God. he was perfectly capable of going the other way round just at the same point in his career. So I think that may matter. In both this work and in the Summa itself, Aquinas discovers a vestigium of the Trinity in the una et ens species and ordo of every res, everything, simply as a thing, thereby suggesting a specifically Trinitarian pattern of ontological transcendentals. Such a registering of the creative of the passage of the Trinity through finitude in terms of existence, shape, and final ordering tracks ultimately back to Origen. This is exactly what Origen says, that sort of material origins reflect the Father, formation through time reflects the Son, and the direction of everything towards finality reflects the Spirit. So even though the operation of God ad extra is unified, nonetheless, in the flowing temporal structure of reality, the Trinity is reflected. And of course, you can read Augustine as building on Origen in exactly that regard, I think. This understanding of the respective divine missions in their essentially united work of creation permits Aquinas to qualify throughout his metaphysics the inherited philosophical primacy of efficient cause over effect. And with the third act of reaching towards final perfection, which is ultimately the grace given end in itself. In other words, he stopped thinking of the three modes of causality as if they were separate. It's all one kind of continuous flow that we're talking about here. So this is a finite imitation of the eternal Trinity, in which the potestas of the Father is always already manifest as the R's of the Son. There's never a moment when the Father is just thinking of producing the Son. That has always already and eternally come about. And both persons are always already the virtus which gives rise to the perfecting love that is the Holy Spirit. Out of some concern to integrate Aristotle with the sustained Augustinianism of his respected colleague Bonaventure in this regard, Aquinas increasingly interpreted human existence as the acme of such created imaging of the Trinity. The thinking of the mind is the needed emanative expression as verbum of a present cognitive power to which it is equal, and thought as a merely natural capacity of the soul is exceeded by its spiritual illumination in love that always draws it towards the ultimate supernatural end, both from the potency of origin and from its intellectual articulation. The third moment of thinking spirit is at once equal to the other two and is the mark of the nature exceeding élan of all of them. So there's a link at this point in arguing there's a Trinitarian ontology in Aquinas and insisting that for Aquinas there is only one supernatural end for human beings. In the Summa Contra Gentiles, this scheme is linked to an overall structure of emanation returned to God via the pivot of the Incarnation, and it is striking that once again Aquinas foregrounds that structure in the compendium, which is the précis of his entire fundamental thinking. And it's much more starkly theological through and through than you might sometimes get the impression reading Aquinas. Finally, although the coincidence of being an essence is for Aquinas a matter of the first metaphysical theology undertaken by reason, he does at times equate Father, Son, and Spirit with the perfected interplay in God of substance, essence, and existence. Since God is an entirely spiritual and intellectual reality, this is also equivalent in him to the interplay of the understanding itself, the intention understood, the verbum, and the act of understanding. Aquinas sees the eminent projection of this triplicity upon God as necessarily following, simply according to reason, from the dynamic and tensional structure of all reality, and especially intellectual reality as it is known to us and to all human beings, whether they're Christian or not. So in all these instances, Aquinas' examples of Trinitarian echoes in the creation go well beyond the merely illustrative, just as his sometimes very Greek patristic insistence that divine essential unity arises from the circumincessio of the three persons, perichoresis in Greek, in John of Damascus, goes beyond the merely appropriative when it comes to their associations with respectively being, reason, and will. So at this point, Thomas Joseph White wants to say that only the primary doctrine of God as what a single essence, known by reason, allows you to get to Trinitarian orthodoxy. But this is completely contradicted by all recent patristic research, which shows that, on the contrary, that idea was regarded as sort of verging on Marcellian heresy of putting the one God before the three persons, and that, on the contrary, the road to Nicene orthodoxy that we were talking about last year was much more in terms of the idea that the unity comes through the substantiations and circulation of the persons themselves. And this, very, very interestingly, tends to make Origen, rather than Athanasius, the real father of orthodoxy. That Athanasius sometimes is near to the Marcellan problem, and it's only the Cappadocians that really return to Origen and sort it all out. So that this presents us with a really rather different perspective, I think, on doctrinal history. And I think it wrong-foots totally the kind of neo-Thomistic perspective. So it's Aquinas' metaphysically Trinitarian approach which allows him to think of these properties more dynamically in terms of relations of origin, both with regard to God and to creatures. He's very faithful to this Greek patristic legacy at this point, just as his Christology is so profoundly Cyrilline. To be now is to emanate, to act or think now is to powerfully express a product. To will now is to convey existence and structure beyond themselves as a desiring. In practice, what is most transformative in Aquinas' thought just doesn't observe the rigid protocols of division between reason and revelation, or between the one God and the God who is three in one. So the new neo-Thomists are sadly more consistent than their supposed master. For them, the goodness, truth, beauty, and intellect of God are fully established by the causal and analogical thinking of unaided reason, with not even an intimation of the operation of grace. They reject the notion found in Bonaventure that only through the generation of the Son by the Father do we fully know God's goodness as love. Yet this notion predates Bonaventure's commenced Franciscan tilt towards univocity, which I'm afraid is there, since this notion derives from Richard of St. Victor. It's also entirely in line with patristic understanding. For if the divine goodness is simply inert and replete, then how do we know that this is not an absolute peaceful autonomy, perhaps of a more, as it were, Asiatic cast? How do we know it's not a kind of absolute peaceful autonomy rather than an outgoing generosity? And we might take this goodness, like the mainline Jews and Muslims, to be absolute justice. But how do we know it to be also an unexpected and more fundamental justice that is overriding divine mercy. How, moreover, do we know the divine goodness to be, in any sense, a personal goodness? And I do want to add at this point, of course, some Muslims, like Jalaluddin Rumi, have recognized the primacy of divine mercy, or Al-Ghazali. Nonetheless, I think that the Trinity brings it home in a more stark and drastic kind of manner. Aquinas himself may seemingly have rejected Richard of St. Victor's approach, but again he is not consistent, and White fails to mention this. Aquinas allows the more dynamic, modal, situational, and interpersonal definition of person as incommunicable that we find in Richard, alongside Boethian's definition of person as individual, rational nature. It's to be noted that Richard applied this definition especially to the Divine Father as unthinkable monarchic origin of the divine unity, with an Eastern echo. Like the later Franciscans, but unlike Aquinas, he believed that a single divine person could, without relationality, could possess a plenitude of wisdom and power, though not a plenitude of charity. At this point, Aquinas is just more consistently patristic. Yet, as regards the character of divine goodness, Aquinas at one point affirms the Richard of Victor's key Trinitarian idea, which is that of the condilexio, which rationally deduces the need for the third person of the Trinity through the consideration that a complete love is not only reciprocal, involving two people, but also productive as further communicable, thereby inherently involving three, that a complete shared love with another person is a shared love of something outside that dyadic relationship. It's very striking that Aquinas at some points endorses that idea of Richard, and yet it is exactly a kind of rational reasoning towards the Trinity. After Richard, Aquinas allowed that one can effectively parse this is it, De Potentia Dei, in terms of the familial image of mother, father, mother, and offspring, with the son in the maternal position of Eve, immediately generated from Adam, and the spirit in the child position of Seth, immediately derived from Adam, immediately from Eve. It's a rather strange sort of family arrangement, and actually the Church Fathers usually presented that in a slightly different way. Parallel considerations apply to the question of divine intelligence. If, with the new Neo-Thomists, we say that God possesses understanding sufficiently in his essence, as far as reason is concerned, then we are succumbing to an Aristotelian ontotheology that takes no account of the Neoplatonic objection that the absolute one and simple cannot think, at least in any way corresponding to our way of thinking, because the only thinking we know about involves a reflexive doubling that is completely inappropriate if we're thinking about the absolute. This is the Neoplatonic advance upon Aristotle at that point, which was generally accepted by the Cappadocians, Maximus, and so on. Several of the fathers had therefore imbibed that kind of Platinian critique, allowing that the originating father does not of himself alone possess intelligence, or even that the infinite God as a whole doesn't think at all in anything like our manner of pondering. It's in Erugena that this is taken to its greatest, but I think very consistent extreme. It's equivalently implicit that the notion of persons as pure relations does not involve any reflexivity that would compromise simplicity. A substantive relation is not in any sense a doubling. It's not a reflection in that sense. It's not like a mirror. At the same time, the doctrine of a primordial word in God suggests, with a critical gain for philosophy, that all thought is first of all productive addition to being before it can open up the possibility of reflective consideration. This happens through turning the self-creation into a self-mirroring in the case of finite creatures, and in God in a certain non-doubling way through the third moment of the Holy Spirit that returns back to the Father only through a further additional outreach beyond that of the Son. Again, in terms of his best theoretical performance as opposed to his methodological fiscal rules as Chancellor of the Cognitive Exchequer, Aquinas tends towards just such an account of reason. We have already seen how, in fact, in terms of degrees of emanation, culminating in the spiritual emanation of the inner word, Aquinas at times brought the Trinity within the scope of analogy when it comes to a consideration of the nature of intellection. Unless one does this, one could contend, the psychological model for the Trinity is reduced to the level of a trivial illustrative metaphor, perhaps indeed something merely regulative in post-Kantian terms. One will then have to suppose that the real core of Trinitarian doctrine lies merely, as for Francisco Suarez, in a series of revealed propositions into which we can enjoy no experiential or mystical insight, something that has been very well historically recounted and denounced by Jean-Luc Marion. Yet White himself considers that the psychological analogue is not incidental to Trinitarian doctrine. That has to imply that just as all animal generation remotely images the divine filial emergence, so also does all spiritual thinking, in qualification of the pertinence of the biological image. And in point of fact, what Augustine offered was not a sort of freestanding model of God by the individual mind, but rather a fully fledged Trinitarian ontology for which trace as recall, together with present self-reflection and future projection, is in some degree present throughout time and space as the psychic linkage of love. This comes to a head in the thinking spirit, but this spirit's true and just thinking, as Rowan Williams has emphasized, is indeed the love of God and others. In this way, the psychological analogue is naturally complemented by a social analogue, clearly expressed by both Origen and Gregory of Nyssa when they indicate that just as God is three persons in one essence, so the human race is one unified essence, manifold in multiple persons. Of course, torn away from substantive relationality that is only fully realized in God, this can become a foolish and idolatrous projection of human interpersonalism. But apart from such debasement, the recent questioning of the social analogue seems to me to have been on the wrong tack. Beyond the patristic legacy, what is ultimately at issue between the Thomistic ressourcement approach and the authentic ressourcement approach to the Trinity of someone like Klaus Hermele is the relationship of Trinity to analogy. For Hermele, in the wake of Antonio Rosmini and others in the 19th century, there are not only created analogues to the Trinity, which revelation fulfills and reason can partially discover, but analogizing itself has a Trinitarian structure. Elaborating Hermele briefly, one could say that only because we're involved in a horizontal analogizing, whereby we must discover and yet not fully discover ourselves in another person and in other realities, that's variously our linguistic product, another individual, and then our shared linguistic co-production. Only through that process? Can we also refine these images in a vertical sense beyond finite and material restrictions? The images are at once of ourselves, of others, people and things, of all finite reality, and speculatively of the source of that reality, without which speculation our sense of this reality remains too vague and uncertain. Within this ascent, we are not just refining the images, but also the spiritual engendering of these images, such that we ascend from the metaphysical and theological outset to the fully personal and Trinitarian God, and not simply to a unity, because we're beginning with the world as relational and with a discovery of ourselves through relationship. And so we build up from this, even in terms of rational intimation, towards something like the Trinitarian God. At the summit of analogy stands the infinite divine reality, who is horizontally fully analogized, so to speak, no longer in himself univocally beyond analogy, but rather its eternal modal and polar fulfillment. To think the opposite is then surely to lag behind the pagans. For much of later Platonic tradition is a meditation on the fact that the ultimate absolute one cannot be just unity and cannot be hermetically inert rather than outgoing. Paradoxically, in order to be one, it must also be different. In order to remain secretly within itself by a reserve of potential source, it must always already have bestowed itself. And then it must somehow be the unity of the one and the many, or of remaining and outgoing. The Church Fathers from Clement of Alexandria onwards saw the more absolute Christianizing, equalizing of the one, the many, and the interweaving, as in one dimension the perfecting of Platonic thought and the resolution of its aporias. Why would one retreat from this level of metaphysical sophistication, open more entirely to our view by divine revelation? In conclusion, I want to add that there's one further dimension to this metaphysical sophistication open to view by the top doctrine of the Trinity. As we've seen, Aquinas adopts Richard of Victor's allegory, declaring that the Father is like Adam, the Son like Eve, born from Adam's side, but the Spirit like Seth, their child, who stands for their unlimited progenitive love. As the purpose to sustain essence always exceeds any will to an immediate sustaining of a form in the particular. It appears then that even God is eternal biology and eternal history, infinite ancestry and legacy. By positing an infinite and perfected horizontal procession in God, Trinitarian theology seems to resolve an aporia to which metaphysics is incurably subject. For either at the very summit of reality, the natural causal horizon vanishes into a kind of acosmic irrelevance, or else along a flattened horizon within which there are no genuine essential distinctions at all, because there's no vertical and qualitative hierarchical genesis, the summit collapses into an endless desert prospect of sheer horizontal immanence of the merely given, as the fact of existence without gift and in any old rearrangeable kinds of shapes. So either at the summit, the ascent to the summit turns out to have been an illusion, as perhaps for Advaita Vedanta, at least on one reading, Or at the summit, there is, after all, no summit, but only a laterally vertiginous, empty plateau, as perhaps for some versions of Buddhism. But for Trinitarian ontology, there is an infinite shimmering plateau, because the finite hierarchical steps to the summit remain in place, and all the climbers remain, in one sense, forever on their way to the summit, and yet in another sense are already levelled and transfigured at their core, to sort of fuse Gregor of Nyssa's Epictasis with Aquinas' account of the beatific vision. This levelling is to do with the necessity of each thing, the full flourishing of each and of all and everything in their co-flourishing. In this way, then, the manifestation of the Trinity alone seems to allow kind of equality of the horizontal natural with the descending spiritual vertical. The manifestation of the Trinity alone appears to allow us the prospect of a return to a source beyond the world that can still, through an equally horizontal dilation, take the world with us and allow us to fully discover it for the first time as it proceeds forth from God. Thank you. So, do we have questions now? Is that part of the agenda? Yeah.
I've heard that London speaks of a four-point Trinitarian theory idea. Can you explain that a bit?
I can't, I'm afraid. I mean, I know I've read Lonergan's Verbum and bits of other I can't recall that offhand, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. I'm not a Lonergan expert, really. Yeah. Hello, yeah.
Well, thank you for such a fascinating overview and some new windows. One of the things that always struck me in reading Aquinas, and I also struggled with, is his explanation, his metaphysical explanation with regards to how the world, or the earth, or the material existence, in a sense, is related to him, right? Because he is, of course, the creator, but he's unchanging. He is eternal, the world is changing, and so, in a sense, he's related to time, right? The world is related to time, but remains unchanging. And as far as I know, the metaphysical explanation or the metaphysical jargon that Aquinas uses in explaining this is he says that God, the divine essence, has a logical relation to creation, and that creation has an ontological relation to the divine essence. So it's not, in a sense, a completely reciprocal relationship. In light of this Trinitarian physics, maybe could this be explained perhaps a bit more clearly, or maybe we could have a better understanding of this?
Yeah, yes. I mean, clearly the question of Trinitarian ontology or metaphysics would involve this question of the relationship of the creator to the creation. And you're quite right, of course, that Aquinas sees that as asymmetrical, because he says that the world is really related to God. Indeed, creatures are nothing but that real relationship to God. But God is not really related to creatures. And, some people have interestingly compared that to things in Indian philosophy, again in Advaita Vedanta, where you're saying, well, when you get to the divine point of view, the sense to which nothing is added to that. But then it seems to me that Aquinas' reasoning is completely right, that you can't see something added to God as outside God. But then the question arises, is Aquinas saying exactly the same thing as Shankara is saying? Or is there a sort of stronger sense in Christianity and Aquinas of the ultimate survival but transfiguration of creatures, of finite things? And, I think one would, whatever the correct way to interpret Shankaran, that is a big issue. It's clear that Christianity does want to say that. So it's important then to realise that Aquinas knows creatures from within himself because he relates to them in terms of his will to create, so much so that creatures within God are more themselves than they are in us. They're more fully in God, So I was saying earlier that Ashard of St. Victor, not Richard, Ashard, in the 12th century says God is much more plural than anything else. He's much more unified than anything else. He's also much more plural than anything else. I think that's a nice way of putting it, that God is unified only in the sense of the absolute unity of the one and the many. And there is this kind of eminent presence of creatures. And that can seem a little, you can see it a bit worried, is God really knowing and loving me as I am here and now, And I suppose one approach to that might be to say, but God is also incarnate. So he's God's knowledge of himself, and even that, even though Christ's essay is an entirely divine essay, but nonetheless, somehow through the communication of idioms, and when you think that the body of Christ is the whole of reality, but somehow in Christ there is somehow more direct relating of God to me and to all other creatures, that if you take that into account. So I think perhaps something along those lines is the way I would go. So thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for food of thought. And what particularly struck was the movement between ontology and logic, if I understood correctly.
Yeah.
Because there is a particular way of not only going about things, but thinking reality. So, and what came to my mind was whether keeping the Trinitarian metaphysics and knowing also what the Thomistic resource is trying to propose on keeping also the Deo non theta, whether we should keep the et in mind, and seeing that at all times what is at stake in metaphysics is a triune structure.
Yeah.
So the force is whether we should, because if we go back to a Trinitarian metaphysics,
Yeah.
it is about keeping at all times that it is totally Trinitarian, but the foundation of being is always Unitarian and Trinitarian at the same time.
Yes.
So the rule of logic
Yes.
would be of keeping both.
Absolutely. I know this is a really, really important issue. Nicholas of Cusa, he talks about the way Aquinas says that every material thing is matter, form, and privation. And he then says, but you should take privation in a much more drastic way than Aristotle. You should see that the third element, although it appears as negative, lack of matter lacks form, form is not complete, it's also the real binding thing that's holding matter and form together. So he is at this point implying that there's always that in the sort of the Greek legacy is somehow too dualistic. That there's always the question of the mediating third, the mystery of what's binding holding anything together, even though it's invisible. So he says at this point, this is because the pagans didn't know about the Holy Spirit. And so he's trying to say that, well, both in logic and in ontology, you always need this mediating third that is, it's what pulls things together and unbinds things and puts them back together again. So that we sort of, and in the Czech philosopher Aquinas, who uses Cusa on this point, there's even more of a kind of intimation of later dialectical and polar thought coming into play. And Aquinas specifically does this in terms of a Trinitarian ontology. So that this is really fascinating. It's almost as if we're saying these people who inaugurate modern thought are thinking very much in terms of the Trinity and of Christology, and somehow the Trinity sort of drops out of our modern thinking, although it comes back with Hegel and Schelling and people like that. And I think there's a lot more to be thought about there. And I think, when it comes to logic, it's not just substance and predicate, but subject and predicate, but what binds those three together? You've got syllogistic reasoning, but how do you know that anything is an instance of anything else? There's always a primacy to a kind of topological searching logic. And even in Aristotle actually knows about that much more than a lot of accounts allow. It's really topics that's really basic. It's really a logical discovery, I think. And then somebody like C.S. Peirce, which is with his theory of the tridicity of the sign, is saying something sort of very similar, that all thinking has this triadic structure, which involves a sort of searching unknown elements. And some people would see that as also the kind of the intrusion of the infinite on the finite, which I think is why Cusa links that to the coincidence of opposites. He sort of says that somehow if matter and form belong together, they sort of collapse into each other. They're sort of like coinciding opposites. They're bound together in a totally incomprehensible way. So the whole question of the limits of the principle of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, come into play there. And whether you can only think analogy as a kind of radical paradox. So that, I'll just to finish these rather random selection thoughts, but to me it's really clear that the reason why Cusa says we have to break with the law of non-contradiction is because he's saving analogy from the nominalists. In other words, he's saying, yes, the nominalists have realized that analogy, which says there's a third between identity and difference, that's broken the law of non-contradiction. And so instead of saying, therefore, analogy doesn't work, Cusa said, yeah, but once you've seen that the infinite intrudes on the finite, you do have to break the law of non-contradiction. So that Cusa is saving analogy, I think. And this is profoundly linked also to his Trinitarian ontology and to the kind of bringing together of the Trinity and analogy that is intimated by Homer, but on the basis, I think, of kind of reading Schelling, Bompard, the Russians, and so on. Thanks. Any more? Or? We need more music now. Yes. I'm not going to sing. I'm sorry about it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Milbank. I now invite Reverend Professor Mark Sultana for a few concluding remarks. I won't be long at all. Allow me to say that I was struck by the the image you concluded your reflection with, that we live in this infinite horizon. Of course, this infinite horizon of love, of knowledge. And of course, this reminds us of Nicholas of Cusa, who used this as one of his analogies. And you connected very beautifully analogy with our personal lives, bringing out the importance of relationships, peace, love. And of course, these are all analogous realities. We can add to them the transcendentals, of course, through which people like Augustine and Thomas also spoke of the Trinity. Augustine speaking of truth, goodness and beauty, and relating them to the memory, the understanding and the will. And Thomas Aquinas speaking of being, of truth and of goodness. And these two are analogous realities. And they are all reflections, participations in the Most Holy Trinity. The Most Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, who are closer to reality than reality is to itself. The Most Holy Trinity, who are closer to us than we are to ourselves, and who are the ground for our relationships, our personal relationships, and the relationships in nature, in creation, in the whole of creation. So this richness in creation, this richness, this profound interior richness too in our personal lives. And you showed very well how we cannot quite separate revelation and reason. No, after all, grace transforms nature. And already through reason we have this vague and confused maybe idea, but still some kind of intimation of the Trinity. So thank you for that, and may we gaze at each other and at creation, seeing that we cannot grasp all, that there is both what is cataphatic and what is apophatic in the richness in our lives and around us. Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Professor Sultana. Before moving on to the reception, we would like to remind you that tomorrow Professor Milbank will address a special lecture to students on post-liberalism, Catholic social teaching, and the reconsideration of corporatism. This lecture will be held at the Theology Boardroom at the Faculty of Theology at 10 a.m. Due to the restricted number of places, it is recommended that those who would like to attend speak to Wayne regarding booking. Thank you all once again for joining us, and we wish you a pleasant evening.